On screen, he was the saint of Walnut Grove, the perfect husband who tamed a monster with pure love. But behind the curtain, Hollywood turned him into a sacrificial lamb, forcing him to plaster thick makeup over his AIDS lesions, demanding he smile for the camera while his body literally rotted from the inside out. They sold the world a fantasy of moral purity while ruthlessly erasing the existence of a dying man just to protect their ad revenue. Steve Tracy wasn't just killed by a virus, he was suffocated by the industry's fake halo, a tragic victim of a machine that drained his soul and discarded his corpse in the dark, all to keep their precious little house clean. Before he was a face on a television screen, before he was a secret kept in the dark corners of West Hollywood, he was a boy in Canton, Ohio. Born in 1952, Steve entered a world that had very rigid definitions of what a man was supposed to look like. This was the era of the post-war boom. The American ideal was being carved out of granite, tall, broad-shouldered, stoic, and commanding. It was the era of John Wayne and Gary Cooper. In the industrial Midwest, where steel mills and factories dictated the rhythm of life, physical presence was currency. From the moment he stopped growing, Steve was forced to confront a reality that would define his entire existence. He was small. Standing barely 5 feet 5 inches tall, with a slight, almost fragile frame, he was physically at odds with the environment he was born into. In the rough and tumble hierarchy of an Ohio schoolyard, being the smallest boy is not a neutral fact. It is a target. It invites teasing, dismissal, and a specific kind of condescension that can erode the soul. Steve learned a survival mechanism that would later become his career: performance. If he couldn't intimidate people with his size, he would disarm them with his personality. He learned that if he could make people laugh, they stopped looking at his height and started looking at him. Charm became his armor. Wit became his weapon. But deep down, a seed was planted, a belief that he was inherently less than, that he had to dance for his dinner, that love and acceptance were things you had to earn through exceptional effort, not things you were simply entitled to. Canton, Ohio, could never hold him. For a young man who felt like an outsider, not just because of his size, but because of a stirring internal difference he was likely just beginning to understand, the Midwest felt like a cage. Like thousands of dreamers before him, he looked west. Los Angeles wasn't just a city on a map, it was a promise. It was the place where freaks became stars. It was a place where reality could be rewritten. In the early 1970s, Steve packed his bags and left the gray skies of Ohio for the blinding sun of California. However, the Los Angeles that Steve Tracy arrived in was not the glamorous Technicolor dreamscape seen in the movies. It was the gritty, smog-choked, cynical Los Angeles of the post-Manson era. The innocence of the 60s had died. Hollywood was a company town, and business was brutal. Steve enrolled in the theater department at Los Angeles City College. This wasn't a vanity project. He was serious. He wanted to be an actor, not just a celebrity. He studied the craft. He learned how to project, how to inhabit a character, how to control the stage. In the controlled environment of a theater, his height didn't matter as much. On stage, he could be 10 feet tall if the role demanded it. But the moment he stepped off stage and into the casting offices of Hollywood, the reality check was immediate and harsh. Hollywood has a caste system. At the top are the leading men, the Robert Redfords, the Burt Reynolds. They get the girl, they save the day, they win. Below them are the character actors, the funny best friends, the quirky neighbors, the victims. Steve Tracy was immediately ruthlessly sorted into the bottom tier. Casting directors took one look at his stature and his face and put him in a box. He wasn't going to be the hero. He was going to be the sight gag. The feedback was constant and demoralizing. Too short, too soft, not threatening enough, not romantic lead material. For a man who had fled Ohio to escape these judgments, finding them magnified under the fluorescent lights of a casting agency was devastating. He spent the mid to late 70s grinding. This is the part of the actor's life that biographies often skip over, but it is crucial to understanding Steve's later choices. It is a life of constant rejection. It is waking up at 5 a.m. to drive across town for an audition that lasts 3 minutes, only to be cut off mid-sentence because you don't look right. It is working menial jobs to pay rent on a crappy apartment, wondering if you made a terrible mistake. He took what he could get. He appeared in small theater productions, doing the work for the love of it, because the money certainly wasn't there. He landed tiny blink-and-you-miss-it roles in films like Heavy Equipment or Beneath the Valley of the Ultra Vixens, often low budget, sometimes bordering on softcore or exploitation cinema. These weren't artistic triumphs, they were survival. They were proof that he was working, that he existed in the industry. But this period of instability did something to Steve. It terrified him. He saw what happened to actors who didn't make it by 30. They disappeared. They ended up waiting tables forever or driving taxis, their dreams calcifying into bitterness. Steve developed a profound anxiety about his precarious position. He realized that in Hollywood, you are disposable. If you don't have power, if you don't have a contract, you are nothing. This fear of poverty, of irrelevance, of being sent back to Ohio as a failure, created a vulnerability. It made him desperate for security. He wanted a home in the industry. He wanted a regular paycheck. He wanted to belong. While he was fighting for his professional life, Steve was also navigating a personal minefield. The 1970s in West Hollywood were a time of explosion for gay culture. The Castro clone look was in: mustaches, flannel shirts, tight jeans. Men were finding each other, building communities, celebrating a sexual liberation that had been suppressed for centuries. But for an aspiring actor, this liberation was a trap. Steve knew the rules. You could be gay in West Hollywood on a Saturday night, but on Monday morning at the studio lot, you had to be straight. Steve was a man of deep contradictions during this time. In private, he was discovering who he was. He was exploring his sexuality, finding comfort in the growing gay community. But professionally, he had to project asexuality or safe heterosexuality. He watched as peers who were too flamboyant were mocked and dismissed. He saw how the industry whispered about Rock Hudson or Tab Hunter. He internalized the message: your talent is secondary to your mask. If they find out what you are, you will never work. So he perfected the ultimate role. He became the nice guy. He was funny, self-deprecating, and non-threatening. He learned to deflect questions about his dating life with humor. He learned to blend in. By 1980, Steve Tracy was approaching his 30s. In Hollywood years, the clock was ticking loud enough to deafen him. He was a talented, trained actor with a resume full of nothing much. He was tired. Then NBC called. Little House on the Prairie was a juggernaut. It was in its later seasons, and the writers had a problem. They had spent years building Nellie Oleson into the most hated, iconic villainess on television. But the actress, Allison Arngrim, was growing up. They couldn't keep her as a bratty child forever. They needed to evolve her character. They needed to marry her off. But who on earth could marry Nellie Oleson? Who could possibly tame the shrew of Walnut Grove? They didn't want a cowboy. They didn't want a rugged farmhand who would beat her into submission. They needed someone different. They needed a counterweight. They needed someone who could disarm her with kindness, someone whose strength wasn't physical, but internal. They were looking for a small man with a big presence. When Steve Tracy got the audition for the role of Percival Dalton, he probably didn't realize that he was walking into a paradox. He was auditioning for the role of a lifetime, a steady gig on a top-rated show, financial security, fame. It was the answer to all his prayers, but it was also the lock on his cage. Joining Little House on the Prairie meant joining the most wholesome, family-oriented brand in American entertainment. It meant becoming a representative of traditional values. It meant stepping into a spotlight that would shine into every corner of his life. He walked into the audition room. He stood 5'5". He looked at the casting directors with those expressive, eager eyes. He read the lines. He wasn't the strapping hero. He was the clever, patient, charming partner. He got the part. At that moment, Steve Tracy won the lottery. He had finally proven to everyone back in Ohio and to himself that he was somebody. But as he signed that contract, he was also signing away his freedom to be himself. He was trading his anonymity for success, not realizing that anonymity had been the only thing protecting him. The little man had finally been invited to the big table, but the cost of the meal was going to be higher than he could ever imagine. Little House on the Prairie was filmed at the Big Sky Ranch in Simi Valley, California. It was a sprawling, dusty, sun-baked landscape that had been transformed into a perfect replica of 1880s Minnesota. But make no mistake, this was not a democracy. It was a monarchy, and Michael Landon was the king. Landon was a force of nature. He was the executive producer, the director, the writer, and the star. He was a man of immense talent and terrifying drive. He ran his set with a mixture of paternal warmth and iron-fisted control. He cultivated an atmosphere that mirrored the show's values. Hard work, no nonsense, and a very specific, rugged brand of masculinity. For the cast and crew, the set culture was intense. They were a family, yes, but a family that operated under strict rules. There were practical jokes, there was laughter, but there was also an unspoken understanding that everyone was there to serve the vision. And that vision was wholesomeness. They were selling an idealized America, a place where men were men, women were nurturers, and God watched over the harvest. Steve Tracy stepped into this world as an anomaly. He was the new guy in a cast that had been together for 6 years. He was physically small in a cast of rugged frontiersmen. And, most dangerously, he was a gay man in an environment that was aggressively heterosexual. Landon, for all his genius, was a product of his time. The humor on set was often rough, locker room style. Homophobic jokes were as common as the dust on their boots, not necessarily malicious, but casual, pervasive, and suffocating. For Steve, every day was an exercise in self-editing. He had to laugh at the right moments. He had to nod at the right comments. He had to constantly monitor his own mannerisms, his voice, his walk. He was playing a pioneer on camera, but he was playing a regular guy every time the director yelled, "Cut." Despite the internal pressure, what happened on screen was nothing short of a miracle. The character of Percival Dalton was a gamble. The writers had decided that Nellie Oleson, the town's resident terror, needed to be redeemed, but they didn't want to break her spirit. They wanted to channel it. Steve Tracy understood this assignment on a molecular level. He didn't try to dominate Allison Arngrim. He partnered with her. The dynamic they created was revolutionary for the time. Visually, they were a sight gag. The tall, imposing blonde tempest of a woman and the short, dark-haired, calm man. But Steve played Percival with such quiet dignity that the height difference ceased to be a joke and became a testament to his character's strength. He was the only man in Walnut Grove who didn't fear Nellie Oleson. When Percival looked at Nellie and said, "You're beautiful when you're angry," the audience believed him. Steve brought a tenderness to the role that softened the show's sharpest edges. He made the redemption of Nellie Oleson plausible because the audience thought, if this wonderful, patient man loves her, there must be something good in her. The response was overwhelming. Fan mail poured in. Women across America wrote to say that they wished their husbands were more like Percival, more patient, more listening, more kind. Steve Tracy had become a heartthrob. He was the safe man. The irony was staggering. Steve was being celebrated as the ultimate heterosexual partner, the man who could tame a difficult woman and build a traditional family. He was being paid to uphold the very institution that excluded him. He was becoming an icon of a lifestyle he was forbidden from having. Success in Hollywood is often described as the golden handcuffs. For Steve, the cuffs were tighter than most. The money was good. For the first time in his life, he could breathe financially. He could afford a decent car. He could afford a nice apartment. He had health insurance. He had the validation of walking down the street and being recognized. But with visibility came vulnerability. In his days as a struggling actor, nobody cared who Steve Tracy went home with. Now everyone cares. He was now property of NBC. He was property of the Little House brand. He began to feel the gaze of the public not as a warm spotlight, but as a surveillance searchlight. He had to be careful where he parked his car. He had to be careful who he was seen dining with. This is the psychological toll of the closet that is often hard to convey. It isn't just a big secret. It's 1,000 tiny calculations made every single hour. Can I wear this shirt? Or is it too loud? Did I hold eye contact with that waiter for too long? If I go to this party, will there be girls I have to pretend to flirt with? Does my voice sound too high? Steve was living in a state of chronic, low-level hypervigilance. His nervous system was constantly on alert. While his bank account was filling up, his soul was being carved out. He was constructing a fortress around his heart, and the only person allowed inside was himself. There was, however, a crack in the fortress, Allison Arngrim. It is rare in Hollywood for on-screen chemistry to translate into off-screen loyalty, but Steve and Allison were the exception. They recognized something in each other. They were both freaks in the perfect world of Walnut Grove. Allison was the hated villainess who was actually a sweet, funny, somewhat rebellious teenager. Steve was the perfect husband who was actually a gay man terrified of his own shadow. They bonded over their mutual absurdity. They spent hours together between takes, waiting in the blistering heat of Simi Valley in heavy 19th century costumes. They developed a shorthand, a private language of raised eyebrows and suppressed giggles. For Steve, Allison became a safe harbor. She was sharp, cynical about the industry, and possessed a dark sense of humor that matched his own. She wasn't buying the Saint Michael mythology of the show. She was just doing a job. But even with her, Steve hesitated. The fear was so deep. He tested the waters carefully. He would make vague comments, drop subtle hints, watching her reaction like a hawk. He needed a friend desperately, but he couldn't risk losing his co-star. If she reacted badly, if she was disgusted, or if she was a gossip, his life was over. He was dancing on the edge of a precipice. He wanted to jump into the relief of honesty, but the fall looked fatal. The morality clause was standard boilerplate in acting contracts, but it was a weapon of mass destruction for gay actors. The text usually read something like, "The artist agrees to conduct himself with due regard to public conventions and morals, and agrees that he shall not do or commit any act or thing that will tend to degrade him in society or bring him into public hatred, contempt, scorn, or ridicule." It was vague on purpose. It gave the studio the power of God. In 1980, homosexuality was legally and socially synonymous with moral turpitude. It was often grouped with drug addiction or criminal behavior. If NBC found out Steve was gay, they didn't just have the right to fire him. They could sue him for damaging the brand. They could claim he had entered the contract under false pretenses. Furthermore, the National Enquirer and other tabloids were entering their golden age of cruelty. They paid informants, waiters, bartenders, scorned lovers, thousands of dollars for scoops. A story titled Little House Star in Gay Love Nest would have sold millions of copies. Steve knew this. He saw the destruction of careers around him. He knew that for a character actor there was no rehabilitation. A star like Rock Hudson might be too big to fail, but Steve Tracy? He was expendable. If he became a liability, the writers would just have Percival Dalton die of smallpox or move back to New York. The wagon would roll on without him. So the morality clause hung over his head like the sword of Damocles. It turned his dream job into a hostage situation. He was being paid to be someone else, and the ransom for his own identity was his entire future. The pressure to confess, to share the burden of his identity with just one other human being, became overwhelming. It wasn't a political statement, it was a psychological necessity. He chose Allison not just because they were close, but because she too was an observer, someone who watched the Hollywood machine with a cynical, intelligent eye. She was the safest bet he had. When the moment finally came, it was devoid of the fanfare that accompanies modern coming-out stories. It was a quiet, trembling admission, delivered with the terrifying expectation of rejection. Steve braced himself for disgust, for the inevitable pullback, for the polite excuse to leave the room. He was prepared to lose his only real friend on set. Instead, he found salvation in nonchalance. Allison's reaction was devastatingly simple. She didn't care. In a world of morality clauses and traditional values, her indifference was a radical act of love. That moment broke the dam. For the first time, Steve Tracy could exhale. The relationship between the two transformed from work friends to co-conspirators. They began to navigate the treacherous waters of 1980s Hollywood together, shielding each other. Allison became his beard, his confidant, and his anchor. But even this sanctuary had its limits. Allison could know, but the world could not. The relief of the confession was immense, yet it only highlighted the stark reality of the cage he was still living in. He had one ally, but the enemy was everywhere. Outside the gates of the studio, Steve was living a fragmented existence. Los Angeles in the early 1980s was a city of extreme duality. By day, it was the conservative Reagan-era stronghold of family entertainment. By night, West Hollywood, WeHo, was pulsating with a liberated hedonistic energy. It was a place where men could, in theory, be free. The bars and clubs were packed with men sporting the Castro clone look, mustaches, flannel shirts, Levi's, an aesthetic of hypermasculinity that was, ironically, a reaction against the effeminate stereotypes of the past. Steve was drawn to this world, but he entered it like a fugitive. He couldn't simply walk into a bar and order a drink like a normal patron. Every night out was a calculated risk. He had to scan the room for photographers, for industry spies, for tourists who might recognize Percival Dalton. The joy of community was constantly poisoned by the anxiety of discovery. He lived in the twilight existence. It was a life of shadows and back alleys. He couldn't have a public partner. He couldn't bring a date to a premiere. Relationships were conducted behind closed blinds in hushed tones. Love, which should have been expansive and celebratory, was compressed into small, secret spaces. This enforced secrecy stunted his emotional life. How do you build a future with someone when you can't even acknowledge them in the daylight? Steve remained, in many ways, perpetually single, not by choice, but by necessity. He was a man who belonged to everyone on TV, but to no one in real life. Then, the safety net vanished. In 1982, Little House on the Prairie underwent a massive retooling, and by 1983 the show was effectively over. For the cast, it was the end of an era. For Steve Tracy, it was the loss of his protective shell. Leaving a long-running hit show is traumatic for any actor, but for Steve it was catastrophic. He was thrust back into the cold, unforgiving market of auditioning. The little man was back on the street. The financial security evaporated. The daily routine that kept him grounded disappeared. Worse, he was now typecast. He was that short guy from Little House. Producers saw him as Percival Dalton, the nice, sexless husband. Breaking out of that box required an energy and a reinvention that he was finding harder to muster. He returned to the grind, the auditions, the rejections, the bit parts. But the Hollywood he returned to was changing. The mood was darkening. The party of the 1970s was over and the lights were being turned on, revealing something ugly in the corner. It started as a whisper, a murmur in the bars of West Hollywood, a small article on page 20 of the newspaper. Doctors were seeing young, healthy men just like Steve, wasting away. They called it grid. They called it the gay cancer. At first it was easy to dismiss. It was something happening in New York or San Francisco. It was something happening to other people, people who partied too hard, people who were reckless. Denial is a powerful drug, and the entire gay community of Los Angeles was overdosing on it. But then the circles began to tighten. Friends of friends got sick, then friends. The symptoms were horrifyingly consistent. Sudden, unexplainable weight loss, night sweats that soaked the sheets, and purple lesions that looked like bruises but never healed. For Steve, the terror was twofold. There was the primal fear of death, of course, but there was also the professional terror. In Hollywood, perception is reality. Even the rumor that you might be sick was enough to blacklist you. If you were gay, you were now suspect. Casting directors began looking at actors differently. A cough on set wasn't just a cough anymore. It was a potential liability. The handshake became a moment of hesitation. The morality clause took on a new lethal dimension. It wasn't just about scandal anymore. It was about contamination. The industry, fueled by ignorance and fear, began to quietly purge itself of anyone who looked like a risk. Steve, already fighting against his physical typecasting, now had to fight against a presumption of illness. He had to look healthier, happier, and more energetic than ever, even as the anxiety was eating him alive. Sometime around 1984, the abstract fear became a concrete reality. Steve began to feel off, a fatigue that sleep couldn't cure, a persistent cold, swollen glands. He went to the doctor. In those days, there was no rapid test, no counseling, no treatment plan. There was just a blood draw and a waiting period of agonizing silence. When the diagnosis came, it wasn't just a medical finding, it was a sentence. HIV positive. In 1984, this didn't mean chronic manageable condition. It meant death. It meant a painful, humiliating, and lonely death. The psychological impact of that moment is impossible to overstate. Steve Tracy, the man who had spent his entire life trying to be good, trying to be accepted, trying to fit into the mold of a decent American man, was now branded with the mark of the leper. He stood in that doctor's office and realized that everything he had built, his career, his reputation, his modest savings, was about to be incinerated. The virus was in his blood, but the destruction of his life would come from the outside world. He knew with crystal clarity that he could tell no one, not his agent, not his parents, and certainly not the press. To admit he had AIDS was to admit he was gay, which broke the contract. To admit he was sick was to admit he was uninsurable, which ended his career. He was trapped in a burning building with no exit. So, Steve Tracy made the only choice he felt he had left. He decided to act. He would play the role of a healthy man for as long as his body allowed. And when that became impossible, he would play the role of a victim of a respectable disease. He walked out of the doctor's office and into the greatest performance of his life. He wasn't fighting for an Oscar. He was fighting for the dignity of his final days. The little man was now carrying a secret that was too heavy for anyone to bear, and he had to carry it alone. In 1985, Steve Tracy began to tell people he had cancer. This wasn't a casual fib, it was a calculated survival strategy born of necessity. To understand why a dying man would lie about the nature of his own death, we have to look at the hierarchy of suffering in the 1980s. Cancer was tragic. It was viewed as an arbitrary stroke of bad luck, a biological malfunction that could happen to anyone, a nun, a child, a grandfather. Cancer victims were warriors. They were brave. They were innocent. When you told someone you had cancer, the immediate response was an outpouring of support, casseroles on the doorstep, prayer circles, warm handshakes, and employment protection. AIDS was different. In the public imagination of the time, AIDS was not just a disease, it was a verdict. It was seen as divine retribution, a consequence of a lifestyle. It was dirty. To have AIDS was to be declared a pariah. Landlords evicted tenants with AIDS. Dentists refused to treat them. Morticians refused to bury them. Steve knew the math. If he said AIDS, he would be fired, evicted, and isolated. If he said cancer, he could keep his apartment. He could keep his friends. He might even keep working. So, he constructed the cancer lie. It was a heartbreaking performance. As the virus began to ravage his body, stripping the flesh from his bones and hollowing out his eyes, he told concerned colleagues that he was undergoing chemotherapy. When he was too weak to stand, he blamed the radiation. When he had to rush to the bathroom to vomit, he blamed the potent anti-tumor drugs. The tragedy was that he had to feign the side effects of a cure he wasn't taking. To mask the symptoms of a disease that was killing him, he accepted the sympathy meant for a cancer patient, knowing deep down that if those same sympathizers knew the truth, their pity might turn to revulsion. It was a lonely, bitter deception. He was stealing compassion because the world refused to give it freely. The physical toll of AIDS is grotesque. It involves a rapid, wasting emaciation that is impossible to hide. For an actor, someone whose currency is their face and body, it is a slow-motion bankruptcy. Steve's daily routine became a grueling session of special effects makeup. He wasn't preparing for a role. He was preparing to walk to the grocery store. He developed Kaposi's sarcoma, a form of cancer common in AIDS patients that causes purple or brown lesions on the skin. These lesions are the scarlet letter of the disease. They are unmistakable. When the first spots appeared on his face, panic set in. Steve learned to layer thick theatrical foundation over them. He learned which lighting hid them best. He began wearing high collars, scarves, and long sleeves, even in the stifling heat of the San Fernando Valley. He bought clothes 2 sizes too big to hide how skeletal his frame was becoming. He wore hats to hide the thinning hair. He was literally disappearing inside his own wardrobe. Every interaction became a high-stakes improvisation. If someone asked, Steve, you look tired," he had to have a ready excuse. "Oh, it's just a long shoot," or "I'm trying a new diet." He had to project vitality while his internal battery was draining to 0. The mental exhaustion of maintaining this facade was as debilitating as the virus itself. He was acting for his life, 24 hours a day, without an audience, without applause, and without a director to yell, "Cut." But Hollywood is a small town with big ears. Despite the makeup and the lies, the whispers started. The entertainment industry prides itself on being liberal and open-minded, but when money is on the line, it is ruthless. Producers and casting directors are risk-averse. They began to notice the weight loss. They noticed the lethargy. The phone, which had once rung with offers for guest spots and commercials, went silent. It wasn't an official blacklist. Nothing was ever written down. It was a soft blacklist. He just stopped getting calls. When his agent reached out, the responses were vague. "He's not right for this. We're going in a different direction. He looks a bit too fragile." The most brutal blow came from the insurance companies. In film and TV production, every actor must be insured so that if they get sick and delay the shoot, the production is covered. By 1985, insurers were requiring medical exams or effectively redlining anyone who fit the profile of an AIDS patient. Steve Tracy was uninsurable. In the eyes of Hollywood, an uninsurable actor is a non-existent actor. He was effectively retired at the age of 33, not by choice, but by bureaucratic cruelty. The career he had sacrificed his identity to build was taken away from him the moment he needed it most. He was left in his apartment watching the industry move on without him, the silence of the telephone serving as a daily reminder of his disposability. While his career collapsed, his medical reality became a nightmare. We must remember that in the mid-'80s there was no effective treatment for HIV. There was no cocktail, no viral load suppression. There was only panic and experimentation. Steve was desperate. He was a young man who didn't want to die. This desperation drove him into the arms of a medical establishment that was flailing in the dark. He signed up for clinical trials. He became a human guinea pig. The drugs they gave him were toxic poisons. Some were repurposed chemotherapy agents that destroyed his healthy cells along with the virus. Others were experimental antivirals that caused severe neuropathy, a sensation of burning pins and needles in the hands and feet that made even walking agony. He endured bone marrow biopsies, spinal taps, and endless blood draws. He swallowed pills that made him violently ill, clinging to the hope that one of them might be the miracle cure. He was fighting a war on two fronts, the virus attacking him from the inside and the cure attacking him just as hard. And through all of this, he had to keep up the lie. Sitting in waiting rooms filled with other emaciated young men, he saw the mirror of his own future. He saw the dementia, the blindness, the complete loss of bodily autonomy. It was a house of horrors, and he was trapped in it. By late 1985, the burden became too heavy to carry. The cancer lie was fraying. The lesions were getting harder to cover. The weight loss was too severe to explain away with chemo. Steve reached a spiritual and psychological crossroads. He realized that dying in silence was a final victory for the shame that had dogged him since childhood. He looked at his life, a life of hiding his height, hiding his sexuality, hiding his partners, and now hiding his death, and he felt a surge of exhaustion. He was tired of the mask. He was tired of the shame. He looked at Allison Arngrim, who had stood by him through every terrifying doctor's appointment, who had held his hand when the nurses were too afraid to touch him without gloves. He saw in her eyes that he didn't need to be perfect to be loved. The little man, who had spent his life trying to shrink so he wouldn't be a target, decided it was time to stand up. He realized that he had nothing left to lose. Hollywood had already fired him. Society had already condemned him. The virus was already killing him. The worst had happened. And in the absolute bottom of that despair, he found a strange, jagged kind of freedom. It was time to drop the curtain It was time for the final performance, but this time, the script would be the truth. By early 1986, Steve Tracy was living in a body that was rapidly becoming a stranger to him. He was 33 years old, but in the mirror, an old man stared back. The virus was a relentless architect, dismantling him bone by bone. But as his physical strength evaporated, a new cold resolve began to harden in his mind. For years, Steve had operated under the belief that silence was safety. He believed that if he played by the rules, if he hid his sexuality, if he hid his illness, if he was a good boy, the industry would protect him. He now realized that was a lie. The industry had discarded him the moment he became inconvenient. The silence hadn't saved him. It had only isolated him. He looked at the other men dying around him in the clinics. They were waiters, florists, dancers, mechanics. They were dying anonymously, swept under the rug of history by a government that wouldn't say the word AIDS and a society that viewed them as disposable. Steve realized he possessed something those men didn't, a name. He was Percival Dalton. He was the nice husband from the most wholesome show in America. He had a platform. The decision to go public wasn't a sudden burst of joy. It was a calculated act of defiance. It was a scorched earth policy. He knew that by coming out as a person with AIDS, he was burning the bridge back to his old life. He would never play a romantic lead again. He would never be safe for advertisers again, but he didn't care. The little man was done shrinking. In a move that baffled his agents and terrified the PR people, Steve joined a small grassroots theater production called AIDS/US, Portraits in Personal Courage. This was not a Hollywood production. There were no trailers, no catering trucks, no union minimums. It was raw, bleeding-edge theater performed in small venues. The cast was comprised entirely of people living with AIDS. Steve was the only professional actor in the group. The others were regular people, a hairdresser, a nurse, a mother who had contracted it via transfusion. They were standing on stage to tell their stories before they died. For Steve, this was the terrifying antithesis of his entire career. Acting is usually about hiding. You put on a costume to become someone else. In AIDS/US, there were no costumes. There was no Percival. There was just Steve. When he stepped onto that stage, frail and gaunt, the shock in the audience was palpable. People gasped. They were used to seeing him in the high-collared shirts and waistcoats of the 1880s, looking healthy and round-faced. Now they saw the skull beneath the skin. He spoke about his homosexuality. He spoke about the virus. He spoke about the terror of the night sweats and the humiliation of the diarrhea. He stripped himself bare. It was a performance of excruciating vulnerability. Critics who saw it described it as harrowing. For the audience, the cognitive dissonance was violent. How could the nice man from Little House be one of them? But that was exactly the point. Steve was weaponizing his wholesome image. He was forcing Middle America to look at AIDS not as a disease of perverts in leather bars, but as a disease that was killing the man who married Nellie Oleson. He was humanizing the plague. Off stage, the reality was even grimmer. Steve had fully committed to being a medical soldier. He was desperate to live, yes, but he was also driven by a desire to contribute to the science that might save others. He enrolled in the earliest trials for AL-721 and other experimental compounds. We look back now and know that many of these early treatments were ineffective or actively harmful, but at the time, they were the only life rafts in a sea of fire. One of the drugs he took was so toxic, it had to be mixed with orange juice to mask the chemical burn it left in the throat. Yet it still caused violent vomiting. Another required him to wake up every 4 hours, around the clock to maintain dosage, fracturing his sleep and driving him into a state of delirium. Steve endured this with a stoicism that bordered on masochism. He allowed doctors to poke, prod, and poison him. He documented his side effects. He became a data point. There is a specific quiet heroism in being a test subject. You are walking into a dark room so that the people coming after you might find a light switch. Steve knew these drugs probably wouldn't save him. He was too far gone, but he took them anyway. Through this descent into hell, Allison Arngrim became his Virgil. The dynamic between them shifted profoundly. On Little House, he had been the stabilizer, the husband calming the hysterical wife. Now she was the rock. Allison was witnessing the destruction of her best friend in slow motion. She saw the lesions spread. She saw the dementia begin to creep in at the edges, the moments where Steve would lose his train of thought or forget where he was. But she didn't look away. In a decade where families were abandoning their sons at hospital doors, Allison moved closer. She drove him to the clinic. She sat in the waiting rooms filled with the smell of antiseptic and fear. She learned to read his medical charts. She also became his fierce protector. When photographers tried to get a deathbed shot of the former child star's husband, Allison was there to block the lens. When industry friends called to fish for gossip, she hung up on them. She was also learning. Watching the way the nurses treated Steve, sometimes with compassion, often with double-gloved fear, radicalized her. She saw the systemic failure. She saw that the government didn't care if Steve Tracy died. She saw that to the powers that be, Steve was just a statistic. The activist who would later become a legend in the fight against AIDS was forged in the fire of Steve Tracy's suffering. She wasn't just holding his hand. She was absorbing his rage. When news of Steve's condition and his participation in the play began to circulate, the reaction from the mainstream Hollywood machine was a deafening silence. There were no telethons for him. There were no special episodes of Little House dedicated to him. Michael Landon, the patriarch, was famously private and controlling of his brand. While there is no evidence of direct malice, the Little House machinery distanced itself. The show was in syndication. It was a cash cow. Acknowledging that Percival was dying of the gay plague was bad for business. The support came from unexpected places. It came from the gay community who saw a brother fighting. It came from the nurses who slipped him extra blankets. And it came from fans, the ones who saw the play or heard the rumors and wrote letters not of condemnation, but of love. But the silence of his peers hurt. Steve had spent years seeking their validation, wanting to be one of the guys. In the end, when he was fighting for his life, the guys were nowhere to be found. By the summer of 1986, the experimental drugs were failing. The virus had breached the blood-brain barrier. Steve was becoming frailer by the day. The play AIDS/US had to close, or at least Steve had to leave it. He could no longer stand on stage for an hour. He could no longer project his voice to the back of the room. The little man was becoming smaller. He was shrinking into the bedsheets, but his spirit was curiously expanding. In these final months, stripped of his career, his vanity, and his future, Steve found a strange kind of peace. He had told the truth. He had stopped running. He told Allison that he wasn't afraid of dying anymore. He was just afraid of the pain. He worried about who would take care of his cat. He worried about his mom. He was no longer the actor Steve Tracy. He was just a man, stripped to his essence, waiting for the curtain to fall. By the autumn of 1986, Steve Tracy's life had shrunk to the size of a pill bottle. We must pause here to contextualize the medical landscape of 1986. Today, HIV is a manageable chronic condition. In 1986, it was a biological wildfire. The medical community was throwing everything they had at the wall, hoping something, anything, would stick. Steve, ever the disciplined professional, approached his treatment with the same rigor he had applied to his acting. He didn't want to die. He wanted to work. He wanted to see 1987. This drive made him the ideal candidate for the pharmaceutical industry's desperate experiments. He became a Phase 1 patient. In medical terms, Phase 1 trials are not about curing the patient. They are about toxicity. They are designed to answer the question, how much of this chemical can a human body take before it shuts down? Steve was ingesting compounds that were essentially poisons. One experimental treatment involved a lipid mixture called AL721, a substance that tasted like rancid butter and had to be consumed in massive quantities. Another regimen involved early, brutal antivirals that attacked his bone marrow, stopping his body from producing new blood cells. The side effects were catastrophic. The little man, already small, was being hollowed out. He suffered from peripheral neuropathy so severe that the touch of a bedsheet on his toes felt like razor blades. He endured waves of nausea that lasted for days, leaving him retching up bile until his throat bled. Yet, he took the pills. He drank the mixtures. He showed up for every appointment. There is a haunting bravery in this compliance. Steve knew on some level that he was being used. He was data. He was a statistic on a clipboard. But he reasoned that even if these drugs didn't save him, his suffering might refine the dosage for the next guy. He was dying so that the medical establishment could learn how not to kill the next generation. As the treatments failed and the virus advanced, Steve's world contracted further. The stage was gone. The car was gone. The apartment became his entire universe. The isolation of an AIDS patient in 1986 was absolute. When he was hospitalized, he was often placed in reverse isolation. Nurses would enter wearing what looked like hazmat suits, masks, goggles, double gowns, gloves. Their food trays were left at the door. Imagine the psychological violence of this. Here was a man who thrived on connection, on the warmth of an audience, on the touch of a hand. Now, every human interaction was mediated by layers of latex and fear. He was treated as a biohazard first and a human being second. But inside this sterile hell, Steve tried to maintain his dignity. He kept a small circle of people close. His mother, who had come out from Ohio, was a constant presence. And, of course, Allison Arngrim. Allison recalls the dark humor that sustained them. They didn't spend their time weeping and wailing. They gossiped. They cracked jokes about the doctors. They made fun of the terrible hospital food. Steve, even when he could barely lift his head, was still a comedian. He used humor to declaw the monster in the room. If they were laughing, the terror couldn't get a foothold. The most painful part of this final phase was the physical erasure of the man the world knew. The virus attacked his brain. Dementia is the cruelest thief of all, and it began to steal Steve's sharp wit. There were days when he was lucid, funny, and present, and there were days when he drifted, confused and frightened, unable to recognize the faces of the people he loved. He wasted away to under 100 pounds. The face that had smiled out from millions of television screens was now gaunt, the eyes sunken, the skin marred by the purple lesions of Kaposi sarcoma. For a man who had spent his life battling insecurity about his appearance, worrying he was too short, not handsome enough, this physical disintegration was a final indignity. He didn't want people to see him like this. He refused visitors, not out of unfriendliness, but out of pride. He wanted to freeze time. He wanted to be remembered as Percival, the dapper man in the waistcoat, not the skeleton in the hospital gown. While Steve fought this lonely war, Hollywood continued to party. The disconnect was jarring. In 1986, the industry was still deep in denial. Rock Hudson had died the year before, which cracked the door open, but most executives slammed it shut again immediately. There was no Steve Tracy fund. There were no benefit concerts in his name. The Little House family, disbanded and working on other projects, was largely absent. This isn't to villainize them individually. Many didn't know, or didn't know what to do. In the 80s, people were paralyzed by the stigma. Visiting an AIDS ward was seen as a risk. But the silence spoke volumes. It reinforced the central tragedy of Steve's life. He was useful to the industry when he was selling a fantasy, but he was a liability when he became a reality. The family values he had helped propagate had no room for a dying gay man. Sometime in November 1986, the fight changed. Steve stopped being a good patient. He stopped caring about the next experimental drug. He stopped asking about T-cell counts. He entered the phase that hospice nurses know well, the transition. It is the moment when the body signals to the mind that the war is over. The struggle to breathe, the struggle to eat, the struggle to stay awake. It all became too much. He began to let go. He had a final conversation with Allison. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a movie script. It was quiet. It was the acknowledgement between two friends that the journey was ending. He told her he was tired. Not the tired of a long day's work, but the deep metaphysical exhaustion of a soul that has been carrying a heavy weight for too long. He had carried the weight of his size, the weight of his secret, the weight of the morality clause, and finally, the weight of the plague. He was ready to put it down. As Thanksgiving approached, a holiday centered around family and gratitude, Steve Tracy prepared to leave the party. The little man, who had fought so hard to be seen, was now ready to disappear into the light. The end came on November 27, 1986. It was Thanksgiving Day. While the rest of the country gathered for a holiday defined by gratitude and family, values that Little House on the Prairie had projected into millions of homes, Steve Tracy took his final breath. He was 34 years old. The fight was over. The grueling experimental treatments, the physical devastation, and the brave public battle he had waged on stage in AIDS/US finally came to a close. He died of AIDS-related complications, succumbing to the virus that had ravaged an entire generation of young men. The little man, who had fought so hard to be seen, was finally at rest. Steve's death was not the end of his story. It was a beginning for the person who loved him most. For Allison Arngrim, the loss of her on-screen husband and real-life best friend was a shattering turning point. She did not simply mourn him. She was radicalized by his suffering and his death. In the immediate aftermath of his passing, Arngrim dedicated herself to the cause that had killed him. She became a fierce and vocal activist for AIDS awareness and research. She transformed from a sitcom villainess into a real-life hero, ensuring that Steve's struggle and the struggle of thousands like him would not be ignored by the industry or the public. His death lit a fire in her that burned for decades. In a final act that permanently bound him to the city of his dreams, Steve Tracy returned to the hills. His ashes were not buried in a cemetery. They were scattered in the Hollywood Hills, specifically under the Hollywood sign. In a detail that feels both surreal and poetic, his remains were placed directly under the letter D. He rests there now, embedded in the dry earth beneath the most famous symbol of the entertainment industry. He became a literal part of the landscape that he had conquered, lost, and ultimately faced with brutal honesty. The actor who played Percival Dalton lies forever in the shadow of the sign that brought him west, finally free from the pain, at one with the dream factory.